This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Sahone, and it's Monday, and that means it's time for the 505th MTG Top 10, the series where I typically rank cards based on their historical performance at Magic's highest level of competition. But sometimes, I also like to do more opinion-based lists that look at the other end of the spectrum, and that's why today we're going to look at the worst elves in Magic. Before we get into the topic, I want to tell you about the Sahone merch store over on Merchland, where you can find Sahone Magic shirts and coffee mugs. I'm wearing one of those shirts right now, which features the MTG Top 10 logo. You can find a link in the description that will take you to the store. Alright, let's get back to the video. So elves are one of the most popular and powerful creature types in all of Magic, with elf tribal decks finding success at one time or another in virtually all of Magic's formats. I've talked about how great elves are in an MTG Top 10 and a deck history on the topic, but I thought it would be interesting to also talk about the worst elves around. While they are pretty good collectively, they have printed enough of them that there are some real stinkers out there. As usual, this type of video isn't based on data the same way lists that look at the best cards are, and the cards that appear on this list and where they are ranked is based on my opinion, but I do use a little bit of data to inform my choices. In particular, cards on this list can't have ever been successful in any competitive Magic format, they can't be cards that make the cut in Limited, and they also can't be widely played in EDH. Alright, with all of that out of the way, here are my picks for the 10 worst elves ever. At number 10, it is Godtoucher. This creature starts with a terrible stat line as a 4-mana 2/2, and the upside it brings to the table is fairly insignificant. The Naya on Alara were all about creatures with high power, but paying 2 mana to prevent damage dealt to a big creature really isn't that great. The ability can only be used on a narrow swath of creatures, and while it is useful in combat, it isn't particularly useful in other situations, and big creatures don't need help in combat that often. If Godtoucher had solid stats and this ability, or a better ability with the same stats, it could avoid being on this list, but unfortunately, it has the dreaded combination of a bad stat line and a bad ability, so that's how it finds itself on this list, and we're going to see that with several other terrible elves too. But hey, at least this one is number 10, and maybe another bad elf will be printed one day, and she'll get knocked off the list. At number 9, I have Findhorn Druid. As a 3-mana 2/2, this has some of the most efficient stats of any card on the list, but yeah, that's when we're comparing it to other awful cards. A Grey Ogre stat line is definitely not good, and the upside of the Druid is incredibly minimal. When it dies, if it was blocked that turn, you get to gain 4 life. If this was a 3-mana 2/2 that always gained you 4 life when it died, it would not be a great card, though it wouldn't be anywhere close to the list. But the fact that even that card wouldn't be that good tells you how bad this one is. Only gaining the life when it is blocked that turn is incredibly bad. This 2/2 is going to be very easily blocked and killed by larger creatures, and going down that card to gain 4 life isn't worth it. At number 8, I have Willow Elf. This is just a vanilla 1-mana 1/1. People often make the mistake of thinking a creature like this is actually worth the mana, and it can be true. A 1-mana 1/1 with a decent ability is usually not a bad card, but a 1-mana 1/1 with no ability at all? That's really bad. It's a stat line that is almost immediately insignificant, so overcoming it with an ability of some kind is usually necessary. And yes, this does have the elf creature type, and there is elf tribal stuff all over the place that helps make this better than a lot of other vanilla 1-mana 1/1s, but obviously, this is a list of elves, so the same is true for every other card on this list, and most of the other cards on the list are actually relevant on more boards than this elf is, even if they are generally much less efficient. At number 7, it is Telljalad Outrider. Telljalad elves hail from Viridian, and they really hate artifacts, so Telljalad Outrider has protection from them. Unfortunately, protection from artifacts isn't something that comes up super often, and it has some awful stats to go along with that generally meaningless protection. Even in Mirrodin and Block Limited, it wasn't very good. It wasn't like people were drafting mono artifact decks in that format, and there were lots of small 1 and 2 drops who lined up very favorably against the Outrider. It was also vulnerable to all sorts of incidental ping damage in the format. There are some other Telljalad elves in the format who brought some more decent stats to the table and actually did see play, like Telljalad Archers and Telljalad Chosen, but Telljalad Outrider didn't get to see play alongside them. At number 6, it is Lady Caleria. While she didn't originally have the elf creature type, it has been given to her retroactively. This legendary elf costs 7 mana, including double green and double white, and it gives you a 3/6. Caleria is one of many famously bad multicolored legendary creatures from Legends. Even though both legendary and multicolored are actually downsides, they costed them like it was amazing upside. Anyway, she isn't quite as bad as some of those Legends, as once she's on the board, she does actually have sort of a reasonable impact, as tapping to do 3 to attackers or blockers can wreck combat for your opponent, but the cost of getting Caleria into play still isn't worth it. At number 5, it is Wormskin Forger. This is yet another elf with really bad stats. It is a 7 mana 2/2. Now, it does come with a pretty decent enter the battlefield ability, as putting 3+ and +1 counters on stuff can be a bit of a difference maker, and it can even put the counters on itself, so sometimes it can be a very impressive 7 mana 5/5. So 7 mana to add a total of 5/5 stats to the board is just awful. +1/+1 counter decks are super popular in EDH, but the Forger doesn't make the cut in very many of those decks, and it shouldn't be making the cut in any of them. There's just so many better things you could be doing with 7 mana. At number 4, I have Wood Cloaker. This elf has morphs, so that means, at worst, it is a 3 mana 2/2. That helps keep it from ending up even higher on the list, but it definitely isn't great, especially because the alternative is a 6 mana 3/3. And sure, if you turn the Cloaker face up, it gives something trample, but the morph cost is also quite high, especially when you factor in the cost of playing it face down, and the upside is only useful in narrow situations. At number 3, it is Ivy Sear. This has the highest upside of any card on the list, but it also has a terrible floor. Hard not to have a really bad fail case when you are a 4 mana 1/1 with an expensive activated ability that is dependent on the contents of your hand. Obviously, a 1/1 dies to pretty much everything, and you don't want to hear that when you're forking over 4 mana. Like I said, the ability does have some big upside, as if you have a grip of green cards in your hand, it can buff creatures kind of impressively, but you just won't have enough cards in your hand for that to ever be efficient, and it isn't really like it's a legitimate trick because your opponent knows it's on the board, and they can even make a pretty good guess at how many green cards are in your hand before declaring blockers or attacking into this ability. Having to give your opponent even more information to use this ability also doesn't help its case. At number 2, I have Elvish Pathcutter. Another awful stat line here. A 4 mana 1/2 was only slightly better than Ivy Sear's stat line, but I actually think the ability it brings to the table is even less useful than Ivy Sear's. You can give Forest Walk to your elves for an investment of just 3 mana. It is going to be hard to find enough mana to sink into this to make your elf army do significant amounts of damage, especially because this 4 mana 1/2 is part of that army. What's more is, Forest Walk is already a narrow ability that is completely useless against most opponents. Of all the cards on the list, Elvish Pathcutter sees the most play in EDH, but I really can't fathom why. I guess it is the only card on the list with an Elvish tribal payoff, and that gets people excited, but this card is just so bad. But there's still one elf that I think is even worse, and that is Viridian Scout. You don't need me to tell you again that a 4 mana 1/2 is awful, since I just said the same thing about Elvish Pathcutter. Obviously, since the Scout is higher on the list, I think the text box on Viridian Scout is even worse than the Pathcutter. When the Scout is in play, you can pay 3 mana and give up the Scout to do 2 damage to a creature with flying. So this can kill a very narrow number of flyers for a total investment of 7 mana. At least Elvish Pathcutter has some board states where you can't imagine it being amazing, like when you have 1,000,000 mana, a bunch of elves, and your opponent has a forest. Meanwhile, Viridian Scout is awful, even in an ideal situation, and that's what makes it the worst elf in the history of Magic. So, those are my picks for the 10 worst elves in all of Magic's history. If you want to own any of these cards because, I don't know, maybe you want to prove me wrong, check out the description where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each of them. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future episodes of this series and a whole lot of other Magic content, don't forget to subscribe. If you want to catch up on past MTG Top 10s, including many more on the worst cards ever, and the various creature types, you should see the playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.